Hi everybody, this is Amy and Annalie again, and today we're going to be talking about more of our organization for our human body and how we divide different parts of the body from one another, and we're going to have a really nice opportunity to practice using some of the terminology that we learned about last time. So when we take a look at this slide, what you'll notice is that we are actually dividing the body into what we refer to as cavities. These are basically hollow regions that contain specific organs. So we're going to separate the body. We're going to start in the biggest ways that we can divide the body, and then we'll move into smaller segments. First thing we're going to see is that we can separate the body into dorsal and ventral cavities. Now remember, I said that typically we use the words anterior and posterior to describe a human body that stands upright. However, this is one of the examples where we have really used the term dorsal to refer to this area along the back. Remember, that was the idea of the dorsal fin that we talked about with, say, a dolphin. So in the dorsal cavity of the human body, you have two subsections. One is the cranial cavity, which is where the brain is housed, and one is the vertebral canal, which is where the spinal cord is housed. So the cranial cavity plus the vertebral canal make up the dorsal cavity. The ventral cavity is going to be everything else. So let's take a look at that. The ventral cavity is divided by one very important structure called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a large muscle that helps us in our breathing, and it becomes the complete divider between the upper section called the thoracic cavity and the lower cavity called the abdominopelvic cavity. So let me erase some of these so we can start fresh. The thoracic cavity is basically the chest cavity. It's within the ribs and it's above the diaphragm. Okay? So thoracic cavity is above the diaphragm. Within the thoracic cavity you have the pleural cavity, which houses the lungs, and you can see those over here as well. And you also have the pericardial cavity, which houses the heart. And again, you can see that in this frontal view as well. And remember, the diaphragm is what divides the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, if we take a look at the abdominopelvic cavity, what we're going to see really is that this abdominopelvic cavity is one big cavity without any area that divides it. So this is in some ways more of a suggestive idea, but I'll show you what we mean. Abdominal cavity is really going to be seen as, let me change my pointer here, as everything above the top of the hips. So the abdominal cavity is everything from that border of the hips up, pretty much. So that's going to have all of your digestive organs, it's going to have your stomach, your liver, your small intestine, large intestine, all of that. And if you look below the border of the hips, and again, this isn't a hard line, this is just an idea, this pelvic cavity, and they show it here, is going to have the bladder, and also if you're a female it would have the ovaries, okay, on either side, and the uterus. So the abdominopelvic cavity as a whole is everything below the diaphragm, but we have this suggested division between abdominal and pelvic, which is bordered by the hips. So let me get rid of all of this and let's keep going. One of the important things we have to talk about in relation to these cavities, particularly we're talking about the ventral cavity, which was the front or the anterior portion of the body. All of these cavities have a very specific set of membranes, and these membranes are double-layered membranes called serous membranes. These serous membranes have an outer layer here that forms the outside of the cavity, but then continuous with that, let me just change my color so you can see what I'm talking about better. Continuous with that membrane is the inner layer of the serous membrane, and it actually touches or comes into contact with the organ itself, whatever that organ is. And then in the middle, you have a lot of fluid, and this is called serous fluid. This fluid is going to help reduce friction and to provide some protection for the organ and prevent these two layers of this serous membrane from rubbing against each other and causing damage. All right, so let me show you what I'm talking about here. Whoops. Okay, so this is going to be found, I said, in all of the ventral body cavities. That means that it's going to be in the thoracic cavity, which has the pericardial and the pleural cavities, and it's also going to be found in the abdominopelvic cavity. So remember, everything we were looking at here, all of these cavities are going to be lined with serous membranes. Okay, here, here, and here. Okay, now just with any type of anatomy, we really like to provide lots and lots of terminology for you. So let's talk about this a little bit. Excuse me. The serous membranes are given specific names depending on the cavity that they are found in. So the serous membranes that are found surrounding the lungs are called the pleural membranes. The serous membranes that are found around the heart are called the pericardial membranes, and the serous membranes found around all of the abdominopelvic organs are called the peritoneum. So the structure of the membranes, the makeup of them, the composition is exactly the same, but they have a different name for each of those three ventral body cavities. So let me go back here and I'll show you. So the pleural membrane, we said, was around the lungs. We said also that these serous membranes are double layered. So let's talk about that double layer really quick, because that's going to matter a lot. There is an outer layer. The outer layer is called the parietal pleura. The inner layer is called the visceral pleura. Inner, visceral, outer, parietal. If you have a real visceral feeling about something, a lot of times somebody might call that a real gut feeling. Visceral just refers to organ. So the part of the membrane that's actually touching the organ is called the visceral layer or the visceral membrane. If we're talking about the thoracic cavity, it's called the visceral pleura. So let's look at that really quick. So, pleural membrane means that we are talking about the membrane in the pleural cavity where the lungs are. The membrane, the part of the membrane that's on the surface of the lungs, is the visceral pleura, and the part of the membrane that's on the outer section, which basically is lining the inside of the rib cage, is the parietal pleura. If you actually were able, if you cut the chest open, I'll try to show you with my hands down here just so you can see. If you cut the chest open and then pulled it out so you could see, this inner surface of the rib cage would be smooth and shiny. That would be the parietal pleura. The lungs would still be on the inside, and they would also be smooth and shiny because they are covered in visceral pleura. So the lungs are covered in visceral pleura. The inside of the rib cage, the inside of the overall cavity, that's composed of or lined with parietal pleura. Okay, so that takes care of the parietal membrane, the pleural membranes. The same thing is going to be the case in the pericardial cavity where the heart is. We're going to start with the membrane that's lining or covering the surface of the heart. That's the visceral pericardium. And the part that's covering the outside of the cavity, that is the parietal pericardium. You can see that over here in this diagram. You see here the blue line is the parietal pericardium. The red line is the visceral pericardium. And then the space in between is that serous fluid or pericardial fluid. Remember, that's what reduces the friction. Really important when you're talking about the heart, since it's constantly beating. You don't want that constant beating of the heart to actually damage and make those two membranes rub a hole in one another. So we really need that fluid to be there. We can move ahead to the peritoneal membranes as well, and let me show you what we have here. The peritoneal membranes are interesting because they really are continuous with one another throughout the entire abdominopelvic cavity. And they create this huge network of membranes called the mesenteries. But what we're talking about here is just the same as what we've talked about with the other organs. Let's say we're looking at the stomach. And here's the stomach, like that. Okay? This is the organ. So the actual lining on this outside surface of the organ would be the what? It would be the visceral peritoneum. Okay? Then we would have a little bit of fluid, peritoneal fluid, right? A little layer of fluid, because we don't want these two membranes to rub against each other. And then we would have our next layer of our membrane on the outside, and this membrane here in blue would be our parietal peritoneum. There it is up there. So you have parietal peritoneum on the outside. That would be if you cut open the abdominal cavity and you pulled open the walls of the abdominal cavity, then you would see that shiny membrane on the inside of the wall. That would be your parietal peritoneum. If you looked inside at the stomach, the outer surface of the stomach or the liver or the intestines would all be smooth and shiny too. That's covered with visceral peritoneum. And that's all continuous throughout all the organs of this abdominopelvic cavity. Hope that makes sense. Remember, you have serous membranes in all of your ventral body cavities. Let's go back here. So all of these ventral body cavities are lined with serous membranes. The serous membranes are double layered. There's the outer layer, which is called parietal, and the inner layer called visceral. And anytime you're talking about these membranes, you're going to have two names. All right? One is going to tell you outer or inner. And one is going to tell you which cavity you're talking about. So let me show you as an example. If we're talking about the heart, well, that means that we know we're dealing with the pericardium or pericardial membrane. Let me see 1 second. I have to try to get this, make sure I get this straight. Visceral pericardium. So if we're talking about the actual surface of the heart, it would be visceral pericardium. If we were talking about let me erase this one real quick. Well, I'll just leave it there. If we're talking about something in the lungs, we know that the second term is going to be pleura. And then for the first term, we have to figure out, are we talking about the membrane on the lungs, or are we talking about the membrane on the cavity wall? And that would either be visceral or parietal based on the location. So hopefully that makes some sense. The pleural membranes are here. They're around the lungs. The pericardial membranes are around the heart. And the peritoneal membranes are around all of the abdominopelvic organs. If you have any questions, let me know that, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.